Okay, and we're back to the Ramadan or Yom Kippur War. As I said, the Arabs took the early initiative, actually reclaiming the territories they'd lost in '67. Richard Nixon comes to the rescue, massive airlift of military supplies to Israel. For Nixon, Israel was the most cost-efficient way to maintain Middle Eastern security. And again, this goes back to the kind of cop on the beat, gendarme argument. Instead of having to do it yourself, you provide the funding and the resources for the Israelis to do it, to maintain American security in that region, which is really, I mean, it's nothing terribly creative. I mean, this is what colonialism is, right? You get somebody else to do this for you. And I still believe that that's the major purpose behind the U.S.-Israeli alliance, the so-called special relationship. I mean, domestic politics are always important. There's no question about that. But I don't buy it. I just don't buy that that's the reason the U.S. does these incredibly one-sided things in the region. The U.S. influence was great after '67. After '73, it just balloons. American military credits to Israel were well in the billion-dollar range. Washington is promising more aircraft deliveries. Nixon is willing to play a more provocative role. In fact, during the war in October of '73, he says, "We will not let Israel go down the tubes." In fact, the fallout, however, we know was quite serious. About 2 weeks in to the war, Saudi Arabia embargoed oil in response to the American missions to Israel. Saudi embargoes oil, then all of OPEC institutes an oil embargo. At that point, things get real hairy. Probably the second greatest nuclear crisis in the Cold War era after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Henry Kissinger, who's basically running the whole thing, because Nixon's dealing with Watergate. Nixon's really kind of falling apart at this time. And in fact, I believe his vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned during the Ramadan Yom Kippur War. But Kissinger's in charge. Once OPEC does the oil embargo, Kissinger puts all U.S. forces on high nuclear alert. This essentially, kind of wakes everybody up, in the U.S. and the Soviet Union get together and they press the Israelis and the Arabs for a truce, which finally takes root. Israel wins. Israel retains everything that it got in 1967, but there are serious consequences. For one thing, the first so-called oil shock takes place. Oil prices quadrupled. They still aren't nearly what they are today. The embargo lasted about 6 months, and this is, if you've ever seen the photos, people in line, gas rationing and all that kind of stuff. At the United Nations, Resolution 338 was passed, and that called for direct negotiations between the Egyptians, between the Arabs and the Israelis, to implement 242 and to develop a region-wide Mideast peace plan. 242 and 338 are still the operative kind of resolutions today. After the war, Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, begins so-called shuttle diplomacy, where he travels to Cairo, to Tel Aviv, to Damascus, to Annam, and tries to kind of get some kind of an agreement. However, the American image in the Middle East is quite low. Remember Atchison's memoranda about anti-Americanism in the Arab world. You would probably see similar words in this period. Soviet Union ain't doing so well either. At this point, Sadat totally kicks out the Soviet Union. One thing that Kissinger and Nixon did, quite clever, was play a double game. Not only did they continue massive support of Israel, but guess who starts to become one of the other biggest aid recipients of the U.S. at the time? Egypt does. So it starts to play a double game and basically seduces Sadat away from the Soviet Union. once Nixon and Ford leave the White House, Jimmy Carter's in. Now, Carter initially promises a new approach. And in fact, right after he was inaugurated, Carter actually endorsed a Palestinian homeland, which was amazing. And he appointed as his ambassador to the United Nations Andrew Young, who actually had good relations with the Arab states. In fact, Young was forced to resign in 1979 when it came out that he had secretly met with Yasser Arafat. However, in all of these cases, Carter kind of throws something out there. He throws a trial balloon out, believes in a Palestinian homeland, so on and so forth. In these cases, domestic politics is important because there's an immediate outcry from the pro-Israel groups in the U.S., and Carter keeps backtracking. So he kind of throws it out there and then comes back. He does, however, begin to talk to Sadat to try to get Sadat to make overtures to Israel. Sadat, remarkably, the U.S. and Soviet Union are both trying to bring Egypt and Israel together. Sadat finally takes matters into his own hands, and in November of 1977 actually travels to Israel and speaks before their Congress, their Knesset. No agreements were made, and in fact, Sadat, in order to appease the so-called Arab Street, calls for a return of 67 lands for the 1967 and Palestinian self-determination. But the fact that he had gone there was really quite remarkable. Menachem Begin, the old leader of the Irgun, who's now prime minister, actually visited Egypt a month later, which is, again, quite striking. Jimmy Carter sees hope there, begins to mediate based on 242 and 338, calls Sadat and Begin to Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland, in September of 1978. Carter wants Israel to withdraw to the 1967 borders, advocates the 242 formula, which is essentially, a withdrawal for recognition and peace. However, once again, he backtracks, both due to Israeli intransigence. I mean, Israel doesn't have the same motive to negotiate, does it? Because it has these lands already. And also because of an outcry among pro-Israel and Jewish groups in the United States. The deal, to make a long story short, finally gets done. The so-called Camp David Accords are signed, and in fact, Begin and Sadat jointly win the Nobel Peace Prize. Camp David essentially establishes a framework for peace. It agrees to negotiations to eventually lead to self-rule in Gaza and West Bank. Little trivia question, that ain't happened yet, all right? Israel does agree and does withdraw from the Sinai in exchange for Egyptian recognition. That does happen. Other Arabs denounce it. This ultimately is probably what gets Sadat assassinated because radical Muslims in his own country take him out in early 1981. All right? So there is a far more stable situation in Palestine than had existed, and Egypt essentially becomes the first Arab state to break and officially recognize Israel. At the same time, there's a crisis brewing in Iran, another one. When we last left our superheroes.
Real quick before you move on to Iran, what was the Palestinian sort of like response at this point? I mean, now we know that there are suicide bombers that, but at this point...
To Camp David?
Just to the Israeli, hostility and continued settlements and...
Sadat was always called a terrorist by the Israelis. I mean, Al-Fatah was conducting that. I mean, the response was fairly muted. I mean, at the time, the Palestinians were still, who was speaking for them? I mean, yeah, Arafat was, but Arafat was an ally. He wasn't even allowed in the United States to speak at the UN. So who was speaking for the Palestinians? Nasser, Sadat, King Hussein, Hafez Assad, So basically everybody's speaking for the Palestinians except for them. So there's really not a whole lot they can do. Yeah, they'll conduct skirmishes and so-called terrorist attacks and things like that. But I mean, realistically, they were pretty impotent. So there really wasn't much they could do. And Nixon's fairly clever. He boxes them in. I mean, the overtures, Nixon and Carter overtures to Egypt. I mean, because Egypt was always a major patron of the Palestinians, or at least seemed to be. And so when Egypt, kind of bails, I mean, it's kind of understandable, but at the same time, the Palestinians really are left without much support. At the same time, there are other crises brewing. Nixon is quite concerned about Arab radicalism. As I said, America's image in the Middle East was not good. And so Nixon wants to find counterweights. Now, clearly, I mean, and again, this gets to the question of how Israel is able to do it. You know, Israel besieged by all these Arab states. Well, first of all the Arab states don't join together. Secondly, there are a lot of Arab states which are in the American camp. And that's really critical to understand. And quite often, especially in, I think, radical analyses of these, the Arab states get a pass. And in fact, you know, they don't deserve it. I mean, the Saudis have been a major ally of the U.S., you know, throughout this entire period. I mean, I think Fahrenheit 9/11, you know, I mean, Moore's getting attacked for it, but he's right. What he said is right. I mean, there's this tremendous Saudi-American connection there. But Nixon actually looks to Iran as a counterweight, beginning in the 1970s. Part of the Nixon doctrine, I think I mentioned that before, was that the U.S. would withdraw from its role in the world. It just couldn't do it anymore the way it used to. And it would find other countries to essentially assume responsibility for American security interests. And in the Middle East, the so-called COP is going to be Iran. Right? And I mean, this is a big country, you know, 60 million or so people. And so what Nixon does is start to, and remember we talked about Nixon's arms sales with the winding down of the Vietnam War and this massive demobilization of military spending. Nixon has to find new outlets for it. And so arms sales become the replacement for development, militarization. So arms sales become a major economic weapon for the United States. So between 1973 and 1978, Iran gets about $20 billion in American weapons, including $5.7 billion in 1977 alone. It is the biggest recipient of American military aid. American training and weapons also go to the internal security force, the SAVAK. Internally, Iran was in tatters. The average income in this oil-rich society was about $350. Half of the population in the late 70s was under the age of 16, and the urban population was expected to surge, perhaps quadruple within 20 years, which meant the job prospects were poor, and they probably weren't going to get any better. In addition to that, there was an emerging throughout the entire region Muslim movement, Muslim political movement. I won't spend a lot of time on it again because it's in front of you every day. But clearly there was an emerging movement of the mullahs to the Shah and to modern Iraq. The Shah was kind of importing American culture and Western ways, which rankled the fundamentalist population. He was squandering money on weapons, alienating the local population. In fact, in America, I think I may have mentioned this before, an American planner, David Lilienthal, had actually gone there to try to help Iran develop kind of a hydroelectric system, and they spent gazillions of dollars, and nothing ever came of it. Nothing ever happened. So the development was clearly uneven. In 1978, things start to turn bad, and you start to see uprisings within Iran. Jimmy Carter, at the same time he's talking about human rights, actually visits Tehran and praises the Shah as a great democratic leader. But within Iran, more and more uprisings take place. The United States supplies tear gas and riot control equipment to the Shah's regime. In addition to that, the United States refused to talk to the opposition, which was headed by an exile in Paris named Ayatollah Khomeini. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who increasingly takes over control of Carter's foreign policy, urges the U.S. to support the Shah, to crush the opposition, to provide the Shah with the means to crush the opposition, or actually to intervene itself if need be. Carter waited, didn't want to take those kinds of actions, lost control of events. In 1979, Khomeini returned from exile, and you see the first Islamicist revolution. It gets worse because Carter, on the advice of Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller from the Rockefeller family, which had significant interest in Iran, let the Shah into the United States because he was suffering from cancer and needed medical treatment. I believe it was at Johns Hopkins. I could be wrong about that. One Iranian diplomat said, "This is as if Franco's Spain had offered to treat Hitler for cancer immediately after the Second World War." And in fact, Carter had been warned, if you let the Shah in, expect bad stuff to happen. He does it anyway, and essentially it's blowback for 1953. The young rebels, the Mujahideen, stormed the American embassy and took hostages on November 4th, 1979. They, within a week or two, let the African American and female hostages go, but the other 52 stayed in captivity until January 20th, 1981. I believe it was 444 days. This triggers another oil shock, wicked inflation, and a huge loss of American credibility. Jimmy Carter makes it worse. He refuses to leave the White House. He's kind of trapped. He's attacked. Kissinger, the right wing, attacks him as weak and vacillating. There's this kind of outcry throughout the country, bumper stickers, Ayatollah, Asahola, that kind of stuff like that. Massive, ironically, massive anti-Arab sentiments. Arabs are getting beaten up and attacked and whatnot. And of course, that's ironic because Iran isn't Arab, it's Persian. Carter's kind of grasping. In 1980, in April of 1980, he actually tries a rescue mission, which is a dismal failure. These planes crash in the desert. The Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, did something that no one had done since William Jennings Bryan. He resigned in protest because he thought it was such a disastrous idea. The United States now has a new enemy, Islamic fundamentalism. It also has another enemy, the Soviet Union. So it has two paths now to take. The U.S. will do two things in the 1980s. It will try to contain Muslims, and it will try to contain communism, right? So the first thing it's going to do is try to do something about Iran. How's it going to do that? It looks for a counterweight. And we all know who that's going to be, right? Saddam Hussein. The United States had been supportive of the Baathists in Iraq, and as Saddam emerged, it took a brief foray into anti-Saddam activities supporting the Kurds, the Kurdish population in northern Iraq. However, one of the great Henry Kissinger stories, in 1975, Kissinger just decided that this is money going down a rat hole. It was wasted money. There was no point in giving the Kurds money because they were never going to get rid of Saddam anyway, so he just quits giving them money. And as soon as Saddam realizes that the Kurds are no longer protected by the U.S., he goes in and gasses like 25,000 of them, at which point Kissinger says covert operation should not be confused with missionary work. Okay. However, wars make strange bedfellows, as do Islamic revolutions, apparently. So when Khomeini takes over, the U.S. sees an opportunity to capitalize. Iran and Iraq had issues over water rights, the Shah al-Arab, over borders, over oil. So the United States sees Tehran as its main enemy in the Middle East, and so does Iraq. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So American support to Baghdad explodes in the 1980s. Saddam invades Iran in 1980. And from 1980 to 1988, brutal war, perhaps a million dead on both sides, brutal, bloody war. The United States sent Saddam over $40 billion in weapons and technology, much of it off book because it was not allowed. In fact, in May of 1987, an Iraqi aircraft hit an American ship, the Stark, with about 30-some sailors dead. And again, it's not unlike the Liberty. I mean, really, there was nothing really came of it. In fact, ironically, Kuwait and Iraq were both flying American flags. They were reflagging their oil tankers with American flags during the Gulf War. In the later stages of the battle, which was eventually won by Iraq, American officers, and this just came out a couple years ago, the documents were released, American officers on the ground with Saddam's army provided intelligence and tactical advice to the Iraqis. And while they were on the ground, Baghdad was using chemical and biological weapons on the battlefield. They had to be aware of that. They were there. Once the war ended, Saddam wipes out thousands of his own Kurdish population with chemical weapons. Meantime, America's economic aid to Iraq increased. All right. So the United States becomes Saddam Hussein's biggest patron in the 1980s, as I often say, because I speak about this a lot. Clearly, Saddam was a horrible dictator, an evil man, a tyrant, brutal, thuggish, murderous, but he also had a label that said "Made in the USA." You know, this is a good case of blowback. So on one hand, the U.S. is going to contain Islamic fundamentalism by engaging Iran in a bloody, brutal war with a client, Iraq. It's also going to take them on, and the Soviet Union, in Afghanistan. And this is another weird case because the United States, which is fighting against Islamic fundamentalism in Iran, in Afghanistan actually ends up facilitating it through its anti-Soviet actions. This is a really good story that people don't know about, which is why I want to spend some time in it. Afghanistan was never a terribly important region. As you can see, it shares a border with what used to be the Soviet Union, and Pakistan here and Iran over here. Doesn't really have resources or anything like that. Potential value as a pipeline, which we know about, but not a terribly important area. In 1954, in fact, Alan Dulles said, the Soviets are inclined to look on Afghanistan much as the United States does on Guatemala, ironically. Afghanistan had always had a nominally pro-Soviet government, but in 1974 things began to shift. And that year, the Shah of Iran, who is supported by the Americans, decides to try to steal Afghanistan out of the Soviet orbit. So he does this in two ways, carrot and stick. On one, he decides to kind of encourage anti-government groups. The government in Afghanistan was led by somebody named Daoud, kind of a dictator. So on one hand, the Iranians begin to fund anti-government, anti-Daoud groups. And guess who these anti-Daoud groups are? More or less fundamentalists, mujahideen, Muslim Islamic extremist groups. So on one hand, they begin to support these Islamic extremist groups against the government. On the other hand, they basically use the carrot and they go to Daoud himself and say, we will outbid the Soviets. Whatever they're giving you, we'll give you more if you join our orbit. So Daoud does that, and he basically breaks away from the Soviet orbit and begins to send, people for military training in Egypt and pro-Western countries. In addition to that, Daoud, with Iranian and American support and Iranian money, begins to wipe out the Communist Party of Afghanistan. It's called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA. All right? Now, the PDPA, the communists, opposed the Daoud dictatorship. And the PDPA, the Afghanistan communists, were split into two factions. A hardline faction led by two guys, one named Taraki, the other one Hafizullah Amin, who essentially takes over ultimately. The other one, a moderate faction led by somebody named Babrak Karmal. These are both communists, but they don't get along too well. Daoud, the dictator, with Iranian money, pulls him out of the Soviet orbit, begins to crush the communists as part of his deal with the Shah. And there are a series of repressive measures directed by the Daoud dictatorship. He arrests communist officials and, starts killing communists and whatnot. So in 1978, the Communist Party, many of its leaders are now in prison, begin to make contact with particular Air Force leaders in Afghanistan. And they essentially get these Air Force officers to conduct a coup against Daoud. And in April of 1978, they overthrow this pro-Iranian government and put the PDPA in power. Daoud is killed, and the PDPA emerges as the government of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union has nothing to do that anybody knows of, and the documents have basically been released now. The Soviet Union has really nothing to do with this April 1978 coup, which gets rid of Daoud. Right? The PDPA is in power, and nominally Taraki is, but Hafizullah Amin essentially is the real power in Afghanistan, and he begins a series of reforms, which seem pretty good. Land reform to break up land holdings, a new women's rights to get rid of the kind of the dowry, the bride price, you know, the tradition of paying for brides. Afghan girls are allowed to go to school, literacy program aimed at young girls, and so forth. On the surface, it looks good. However, it's not implemented very well. It's implemented very heavy-handedly. And so what it does is trigger rebellion against the central government. And this leads to the emergence of the Mujahideen, holy warriors. Initially, and this is the case in Iran too, the Mujahideen weren't initially all Muslim fundamentalists. There were significant kind of leftist elements, including Marxist elements in the Mujahideen, which eventually were kind of pushed out by the more Islamic elements there. But by 1978, the regime, the Amin regime, was so heavy-handed. It's kind of like, you know, urban intellectuals going into villages and really kind of telling people what to do, more secular than Muslim. So by mid-1978, a majority of country probably is already opposed to this new government. In addition to that, the Amin faction in the Afghan communist movement begins to wipe out the other moderate communists. They begin to put people in jail and execute them, and so it's really ugly. By the end of 1978, the Afghan communist movement is in really bad shape, and in fact, the Soviet Union decides to try to restore order. They send an official from the Central Committee to Kabul in October of 1978 to put a stop to the mass repressions, which have taken on increasing proportions. The Soviet Union sends officials to Afghanistan in late 78 in order to get the so-called communist government to chill out, to quit attacking people, all right? However, things get worse, and in early 1979, in a city in northwest Afghanistan, Herat, a rebellion takes place in which nearly an entire division of the Afghan army jumps ship, deserts, and joins the Mujahideen fighting against the government. All right, the Soviet Union is really getting worried because this is a country which shares a border. That's the Soviet Union's real interest, a strategic border. There was some suggestion that the Soviet Union was concerned about Afghanistan for access to the Persian Gulf and all this other stuff. No evidence that anybody ever brought that up. They're concerned that Afghanistan remain a buffer zone because you have Pakistan and Iran, which are Soviet enemies nearby. So the Soviet Union in March of 1979, after this desertion by a division of the Afghan army to the Mujahideen, meets. The Politburo meets in Moscow. And in the first meeting on March 17, 1979, the foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, says, look, we got to do something. We cannot afford to lose Afghanistan. We have, you know, the strategic, these security concerns there. A day later, the tone of the meeting changed dramatically. The first person to speak was actually the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, who was normally a hardliner. Andropov says, and I'm going to quote at some length because I think it's important. Andropov says, we must consider very, very seriously the question of whose cause we will be supporting if we deploy our forces into Afghanistan. It's completely clear to us that Afghanistan is not ready at this time to resolve all the issues it faces through socialism. The economy is backward. The Islamic religion predominates, and nearly all of the rural population is illiterate. We know Lenin's teachings about a revolutionary situation. Whatever situation we are talking about in Afghanistan, it is not that type of situation. Therefore, I believe that we can suppress a Mujahideen revolution in Afghanistan only with the aid of our bayonets. And that is for us entirely inadmissible. We cannot take such a risk. The people don't support the government. Would our troops really help them there? In such a situation, tanks and armored cars cannot save everything. Gromyko switches and says, I agree completely. I completely support Comrade Andropov's proposal to rule out such a measure. Alexei Kosygin then goes to Afghanistan to tell the government that it will not be getting any help from the Soviet Union, and says our troops would have to fight not only with foreign aggressors, but also with a certain number of your Afghan people, and people do not forget such things. Foreign aggressors, who did he mean? Pakistan was aiding the Mujahideen, but in addition to that, in July of 1979, the United States, the CIA began a program to funnel secret aid through Pakistan to the Mujahideen. And this attracted kind of an international coterie of radical Muslims. Now remember, this predates, well, not really predates, it occurs simultaneously with the Iranian Revolution. So there's this outpouring of kind of Muslim politics throughout the region, and all these people say Afghanistan is the place to be. It's kind of like lefties going to fight in the Spanish Civil War. So you start to see this kind of flurry of freedom fighters, right? Mujahideen. And the United States is helping to fund a lot of that. So in 1979, although the Soviet Union is trying to restrain the government, in 1979, the most extreme faction of the Afghan communist movement, led by Hafizullah Amin, totally seizes power and kills off everybody. It really is kind of a bloodbath. And the U.S. has already been funding the Mujahideen. So this is before. The U.S. funds the Mujahideen before the Amin coup. The U.S. begins funding in July. The coup in which Amin wipes out all his opponents occurs in September. All right. Zbigniew Brzezinski later claims, probably bragging, that he did this on purpose because he was going to lure the Soviet Union into an Afghanistan trap. Well, it may have worked. Finally, the Amin dictatorship becomes so brutal that the Soviet Union does send troops into Afghanistan in December, around Christmas of 1979. The Soviet Union goes in to eliminate a communist government. They kill Hafizullah Amin and reestablish control from the more moderate faction. Babrak Karmal actually becomes president in 1979. So the Soviet Union actually got rid of a communist government in Afghanistan. All right. Why did they do it? In April of 1980, a few months later, the Politburo said the Soviet military intervention prevented the emergence of a new hotbed of military threat on the southern borders of the Soviet Union. It put an end to Amin's adventurous policy line. Gradually, the understanding emerges there could not be any resolution of the Afghan question without accepting the fact that Afghanistan, being the Soviet Union's immediate neighbor, is part of Soviet special interest. Why did the Soviet Union do it? Because it wanted this buffer zone. Okay? Nothing suggests that the Soviet Union was going to use Afghanistan as a staging area or needed access to the Persian Gulf. Now, Brzezinski jumped all over this, and the United States takes a hard line. What does it do? Carter goes ballistic. He cancels SALT II. He boycotts the Olympics. He begins draft registration. He begins a massive military buildup, a projection of $1.2 trillion in military budgets. And he begins funding through Pakistan the Mujahideen. Now, there were voices out there saying, whoa, Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State, and George Kennan, who knew more about the Soviet Union than any American diplomat probably in the entire 20th century, were saying, chill out. All right? The Soviet Union is responding to dangerous problems on their border. What they're doing makes sense. Afghanistan is not that important, which is what everybody was saying. The Wall Street Journal was writing that. Nonetheless, Brzezinski gets Carter's ear and decides to do something about it. Now, why is this important? Because we already know why this is important. Because who were some of the groups funded by the United States? This war lasts from 1979, the U.S. covert war, so-called covert war, which was quite open, against the Soviet-backed government, lasts for a decade and a half. Who was getting the money? Ultimately, tens of millions of dollars. Stinger missiles, surface-to-air missiles. Who did that go to? It went to the Mujahideen. And who did the Mujahideen become? The Taliban. And what did the Taliban do? They gave sanctuary to people who would be considered terrorists, like Osama bin Laden. If you've seen 911, Fahrenheit 911, Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia says the only time he ever met Osama bin Laden was when he came to thank him, to tell him to thank the United States for the aid that the U.S. had given to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I mean, this is like the all-time case of blowback, right? So the U.S., in order to get the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, when in fact the Soviet Union was actually moderating politics in Afghanistan, ultimately helps create one of the greatest terror organizations of the 20th century. Yeah.
Isn't Carter's response basically the reaction to the poor domestic showing that the means of both and the
the hostages were taken in November. The oil shocks create an inflation rate of over 20%. He's paralyzed. The rescue mission is an utter disaster. This guy was just, I mean, he was a possum trapped in a garage. Yeah, he go for deer in the headlights, any metaphor you want. He had to appear tough. I mean, but I think it also, I mean, it clearly represented Brzezinski's view of the world. I mean, I think in retrospect, turning foreign policy over to Brzezinski and essentially, humiliating Cyrus Vance was a dreadful mistake. Brzezinski considered himself Kissinger's rival, and he wasn't as smart as Kissinger. Certainly wasn't as suave as Kissinger. So the only way he could out Kissinger was by being, I think, kind of more hard line. I think, and Carter was under attack from the right wing. It's kind of, interesting. I mean, I never do kind of what if history, but I don't know if Kissinger would have done the same thing had he been Secretary of State at the time. I'm not sure Kissinger would have done it the same way. I mean, ultimately, it's a disaster. I mean, Carter's just paralyzed. It's disastrous. Anyway, that's quite. I mean, I think that's an important story, and I like to spend some time on it. Afghanistan, because, I mean, especially now, we know what happened on September 11th, 2001, and who did it, and it's really interesting, the kind of whole, who is it, why do they hate us kind of questions which emerge, and I mean, the United States, how does the U.S. respond to 9/11? Well, the first response is actually to attack Afghanistan, right? Because Afghanistan was giving sanctuary to these people. Well, where did these people come from? Well, actually, these are the people the U.S. was giving arms to, for about 15 years in order to get rid of the Soviet Union. So in Iran, it foments a war with Iraq, which kills millions of people, over 1 million people, in order to contain Islamic fundamentalism. But in Afghanistan, what does it do? It unleashes Islamic fundamentalism, right? I mean, this goes back, remember, in the 50s when we talked about Indonesia, one of the first groups that the U.S. supported against Sukarno was actually a radical Muslim group. Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country in the world. So the United States, it's really, kind of an inchoate approach in the long run, which has real serious consequences, right? Any questions on that? All right, going to go back to Israel, back to Palestine. This is a political tour de force of the Middle East, right? In 1981, Israel announced that it would annex the Golan Heights from Syria. And the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, amazingly says, how long do we have to go on bribing Israel? You start to see for a decade, under the Republicans, you actually see the most even-handed policy in the post-1967 era toward Israel. The Reagan and Bush 41 administrations actually do things differently. Israel, in 1981, which has always felt emboldened, begins to bomb PLO camps in Lebanon. And in 1982, Israel actually invades Lebanon. I forgot to put a map up, but it's directly to the east. Whenever people give me directions and say, go right, go west, go south, it's like, no, tell me right or left. So anyway. Israel begins to bomb and then invades Lebanon in what was called Operation Peace for Galilee. Syria had been aiding the PLO and getting Soviet aid, so they were being targeted too. Egypt's recognized Israel's right to exist now. They had gotten the Sinai back by 1982, so Egypt, Israel doesn't really fear Egypt any longer. So Israel begins to pound Beirut. I mean, I remember seeing the news, the images on the news where these massive shells would hit, apartment complexes and just wipe them out. Thousands were killed in Lebanon by these Israeli attacks. The Israelis also had planned on putting a new government in power led by a Christian named Bashir Gemayel. He was kind of the Israel's hand-picked candidate for president, and he actually wins the election in 1982, but in September he was assassinated, probably by Hezbollah. At that point, Israel decides to get even. It is supposed to be guarding 2 refugee camps in Lebanon. at Sabra and Shatila, Israeli guards allow the pro-Gemayel groups. They're called phalangists. Phalangist was also a term used by Franco. Phalangist is almost like fascist. They allow these Christian phalangist groups, the IDF, the Israelis are supposed to be guarding the refugees. Instead, they allow these Lebanese terrorist groups in to Sabra and Shatila, where they kill over 3,000 refugees. Right? There's a picture of bodies laying all over the place. A massive international scandal. Right? Israel gets global condemnation for this. And in fact, the Israeli government conducts an investigation of Sabra and Shatila. And they hold the Israeli defense minister accountable for it, and they hold that he can never again serve as the defense minister in any Israeli cabinet. Does anybody know who that is? He's the prime minister. He can't be defense minister, but he's the prime minister, Ariel Sharon. All right? Begin, Shamir, Sharon, prime ministers of Israel, who have clearly defined terrorist backgrounds. Right? I mean, they were part of the Stern gang in the Irgun. The U.S. steps in, yeah.
Why did the Christian want to kill the Palestinian refugees?
Gemayel was a Christian. He was pro-Israel. There are about 3 million Palestinian refugees in the Middle East, outside of Palestine. A lot of them are in Lebanon. And the PLO had established bases in Lebanon because they thought they were safe. Israeli starts to pound these PLO bases, and these Palestinians go to refugee camps. Once Gemayel is assassinated by probably Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad, then the Christians want revenge, so they go into Sabra and Shatila, and the Israelis step aside and let them go in and slaughter these like 3,000 or so people. Yeah. The U.S. steps in and actually arranges joint withdrawal from PLO and Israel and sends in American Marines as peacekeepers. You probably recall, or you may recall, what happened. In April of 1983, the U.S. Embassy was bombed with over 60 Americans killed. Then in October of 1983, a Marine barracks where American Marines, peacekeepers, were being held in Beirut was bombed with about 240 dead. Reagan withdraws. It's kind of funny because Reagan, we will never retreat. We will stay and fight. We're not going to let terrorists. And, within 5 months, the Americans were out of Lebanon. However, Israel got a $3 billion foreign aid package out of it. As I said, it was somewhat even-handed. By no means am I suggesting that the Republicans in the 80s abandoned Israel. That clearly wasn't the case. Palestine is still boiling, as you can imagine. And this is where the kind of leadership issue becomes critical. There's really kind of a void in leadership. Arafat is essentially incapable of really doing much of anything. He doesn't have an independent state. He's not recognized. The U.S. won't even let him into New York to speak at the United Nations. In addition to that, the economic situation of Palestine is dreadful. No jobs, massive unemployment. Vast majority of youth are being raised in refugee camps. There's wide-scale disillusion. The number of Jewish settlements where they go in and simply take land away, force Palestinians to give up their land, force appropriations, is growing. Israel rules over 500,000 people in the West Bank and Gaza alone. So in December of 1987, almost spontaneously, there was an automobile incident where an Israeli vehicle plows into these Palestinians and kills several of them. The Palestinians blow, they erupt spontaneously, especially the youth, into intifada. Intifada basically means shaking off, getting it out of your system kind of thing, an outburst. This is a popular uprising. The PLO leadership doesn't control it, doesn't coordinate it. The United States steps in, tries to do something about it, begins to meet actually with the PLO in Tunisia in late '88, but Israel blasts it. Reagan is gone, George Bush is in. Bush's Secretary of State is Jim Baker. Baker is amazing. Baker publicly presses Israel. Baker and Bush publicly press Israel. Jim Baker publicly says to Israel, lay aside once and for all the unrealistic vision of a greater Israel. forswear annexation, stop settlement activity, reach out to the Palestinians as neighbors who deserve political rights. Privately, Baker was alleged to have said, Jews, they don't vote for us anyway. Israel rebuffed Baker. They did not take his advice, and it didn't really matter because the aid to Israel went from $3 billion in 1989 to $4.7 billion in 1992. What happened, though, in between 1989 and 92? What real big event happened? The first Gulf War. And who did Arafat support in that war? Iraq. Arafat blew it. Big, big strategic political blunder. Israel was America's ally, so even though Israel's not doing what the U.S. suggests it do, it remains the cop on the beat. Okay? This leads then to the Gulf War. Okay? The Intifada is still raging, but Saddam's support of Iraq is a major problem. How does the Gulf War get started? And again, I can go through this fairly quickly. You should know this stuff. Partly it's about the Middle East, and partly it's about something more than that. By the late 80s, the United States is searching for enemies, rogues, terrorists. It needs somebody to justify continued defense buildups and military spending. And the Soviet Union can't do it anymore. The Soviet Union is in disarray, right? With the downfall of the USSR, the American rationale for these huge military budgets and this huge defense establishment is falling apart. So they have to find ways to continue their military hegemony and to continue to spend a lot of money, because everyone's saying, hey, we don't have to spend money more. We have a peace dividend. We can cut defense spending. In 1980, military budget had been $143 billion. By 1995, it had doubled, almost $300 billion. In the 80s, in the Reagan years, military Keynesianism was at its apex, running up massive deficits, building B-1 bombers, MX, intercontinental ballistic missiles, Trident II, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, conjuring up visions of Star Wars through SDI, 2.2 million military personnel. American military doctrine was based on a high-intensity conflict against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And boom, almost magically, overnight, it's gone. The Berlin Wall falls and Gorbachev falls, and pretty soon you don't have the same enemies. And a lot of people are saying, you need to cut the defense budget. Not just peaceniks, not just the McGovernites, right? People like Robert McNamara, Vietnam-era Secretary of Defense, Lawrence Korb, who had been Assistant Secretary of Defense under Reagan. A lot of people are saying, we don't need this kind of a military establishment anymore. We can have serious cutbacks and start to spend the money on the environment and education and health and all kinds of stuff like that. This isn't just the kind of hippie faction. This is like a lot of people who were part of the, the kind of architects of the Cold War saying, we won, we won. Well, not so easy. The administration wants to be able to maintain the kind of political economy it had been, it had created after 1945. So you need to find enemies. And what they do is dust off kind of a version of the old counterinsurgency doctrine that we saw in the Vietnam era, this time called LIC, low intensity conflict. All right? Low intensity conflict means, yeah, we won't be fighting this massive war in the European plains against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, but there are going to be smaller wars that we're going to have to deal with. And they begin to focus on emerging regional powers. That's how they refer to them, emerging regional powers. China, Turkey, Argentina, India, North and South Korea both, and Iraq. But Iraq was America's ally, right? They had just fought, helped them for 8 years. Well, between 1975 and 1990, a lot of these emerging regional powers, basically because of the Nixon doctrine of selling arms to anybody with an open checkbook, had acquired massive weapons buildups. And they were getting nuclear weapons, chemical, biological warfare weapons, the so-called WMDs, the weapons of mass destruction. So by 1990, the United States is looking for enemies, and boom, there it is. The Army Chief of Staff, Carl Vuono, said, many third world countries now possess mounting arsenals of tanks, heavy artillery, ballistic missiles, and chemical weapons. The United States cannot ignore the expanding military power of these countries, and the Army must retain the capability to defeat potential threats wherever they occur. This could well mean confronting a well-equipped army in the third world. And where does it become? Carl Vuono would later say, The 2nd of August, 1990, will be remembered for generations to come as a turning point for the United States in its conduct of foreign affairs. The day America announced the end of containment and embarked upon the strategy of power projection. And what was August 2nd, 1990? It was the day Iraq invaded Kuwait. And the United States began to apply the doctrine, the so-called Powell Doctrine, Colin Powell was one of the architects of it, of power projection. Now, the idea that the U.S. hadn't done this before, of course, is fairly ludicrous. The U.S. has been projecting its power the entire 20th century all over the place, right? But Iraq becomes a great way to test this out, to play it out. A few days before August 2nd, just a week before that, on July 25th, 1990, the American ambassador to Baghdad, April Glasby, had sat down and met with Saddam Hussein and said, I have a direct instruction from the president to seek better relations with Iraq. She also said, because she knew that there had been border tensions between Iraq and Kuwait. There had been OPEC production cutbacks in order to raise the price of oil. Kuwait had apparently undercut those agreements. In addition to that, there had been continuing conflict over where the border actually was because it was an artificial border. And in addition to that, Kuwait actually had been doing slant drilling, and it really was stealing Iraqi oil. The Iraqis didn't make that up, right? So April Glasby says to Saddam, we have no opinion on inter-Arab disputes such as your border dispute with Kuwait. Earlier that spring, in fact, the Assistant Secretary of State, John Kelly, had called Saddam Hussein, quote, a force of moderation in the region. So, on August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein probably could not have imagined that the U.S. would act the way it did. And in fact, in the early hours after the invasion, George Bush didn't do a whole lot. Allegedly, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Britain, got a hold of him and said, don't go wobbly on me. And so Bush stands up and puffs his chest out and says, this will not stand. And he begins the deployment to the Gulf. But in fact, it's a limited deployment. And in fact, Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, on September 11th, 1990, goes to Congress and says, specifically, we were told by the President to deploy forces in order to deter further aggression by Iraq against other nations in the region and to defend Saudi Arabia and others should deterrence fail. What's the point of Operation Desert Shield, according to Dick Cheney? To protect the Saudis and to make sure Iraq doesn't invade anyone else. Does it say anything about taking offensive action against Iraq? No. But Bush makes it more than that. Turns it into Colin Powell's doctrine of power projection. During the ramp up to the war, ironically, many military people, including the 3 previous chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified publicly before Congress that the U.S. should not do this, that the sanctions put in place after August 2nd were working, and that Saddam, probably would be forced out of Kuwait eventually, and certainly was no threat to go anywhere else. I mean, Saudi was safe and everywhere else. Bush, however, wanted to liberate Kuwait and also to ensure the health of the military-industrial complex at home. So Desert Shield continues. What's ironic, and this is something that's really telling in the ramp up to the first Gulf War and to the attack on Iraq in 2003, is what Saddam Hussein does. From August 1990 until the war begins, till the attacks begin in January of 1991, what did Saddam do? Nothing. Saddam Hussein essentially sat back and allowed this massive Western deployment to begin. He does nothing. He sat passively and allowed this massive buildup to take place, which indicates he's not exactly a military genius, right? And I remember at the time, the media's, it's the 4th biggest army in the world and it's going to be a bloodbath and the mother of all battles. And all of a sudden, it sounded convincing, You don't think, well, the guy, if he's got all that, why is he allowing this coalition to just build up and place this massive, cordon around him? But it did. Desert Storm began on January 17th. It was a relentless air war. Saddam grounded his air force. He didn't even fight back. When ground troops took over a month later, they steamrolled into Baghdad. Perhaps 25,000 were dead, about 1.8 million homeless. In the south, a group of anti-government Shia rose up. In the north, a group of anti-government Kurds rose up. The United States did nothing in either case. Saddam Hussein remained in power. The Shia and Kurds thought the U.S. would come in and support their rebellions against Saddam, but it didn't. In 1998, George Bush Sr., along with his National Security Advisor Brett Scowcroft, wrote a book talking about that. And they said, trying to eliminate Saddam, extending the ground war into an occupation of Iraq would have incurred incalculable human and political costs. Apprehending him was probably impossible. We'd been unable to find Noriega in Panama, which we knew intimately. We would have been forced to occupy Baghdad and, in effect, rule Iraq. The coalition instantly would have collapsed, with Arabs deserting it in anger and other allies pulling out as well. Under those circumstances, furthermore, we had been self-consciously trying to set a pattern for handling aggression in the post-Cold War world. Going in and occupying Iraq, thus unilaterally exceeding the UN's mandate, would have destroyed the precedent of international response to aggression that we'd hoped to establish. Had we gone the invasion route, the U.S. could conceivably still be an occupying power in a bitterly hostile land. It would have been a dramatically different and perhaps barren outcome. Right? It's not Teddy Kennedy, that's not Robert Byrd, that's George W. Bush in 1998. So Saddam stays, but Iraq has to pay for the war. Resolution 687 made Iraq accept the Kuwait border, accept UN peacekeepers, fully disclose all chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, and cooperate in their destruction. UN inspectors by 1992 had destroyed over 100 Scud missiles, 70 tons of nerve gas, and 400 tons of mustard gas. UN inspectors put Iraq's capacity for mass destruction by 92 at 0. That doesn't mean Iraq did not continue to have weapons, but it did not have weapons which had a realistic ability to cause destruction. Iraq was contained, right? What's happening elsewhere? Well, the Iraq War had been a major, a devastating defeat for the Palestinians. Arafat supported Saddam, right? Nonetheless, even after the war, as Israel's getting $4.7 billion in aid, George Bush, 41, withholds a $10 billion loan guarantee to Israel because of Israel's continued settlements in occupied territories. So Bush, not only tells the Israelis to forswear annexation, but withholds $10 billion in loan guarantees because they're doing the settlements. So what you have here, and Bush 41 was actually quite popular among the Arab population. In the 2000 election, Arab Americans overwhelmingly voted for his son, assuming that his father had done a fairly even-handed job, considering all things. So Bush withholds that. In Israel, there was a new labor government in power led by Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, and they actually began talking to the PLO secretly in Norway, in Oslo. And in September of 1993 began, signed the Oslo Accords, which were essentially a process. In it, Arafat recognized Israel's right to exist. Rabin recognized the PLO as a representative of the Palestinians and a negotiating partner. And they set up timetables to return Gaza and the West Bank to Palestinian rule. Israel, however, retained authority over Palestinian foreign affairs, over security, over settlements, until a final resolution. If you look at, today, if you look at any fact sheet or international agreement, it will always say, pending further negotiation when you read about Gaza or the West Bank. Arafat was actually attacked by his own people. Edward Said, a well-known Palestinian intellectual, called it a Palestinian Versailles, a sellout. That basically Arafat gave up what little leverage he had, that Israel retained control over the Palestinians, that this timetable didn't, give the Palestinians anything. It's on there. It's worth taking a look at. Israel still controlled, the massive portion of the occupied territories, controls the lives of I forget how many, well over 1 million Palestinians there. Oslo was hailed as a great breakthrough. Arafat Rabin actually shook hands at the White House with Bill Clinton standing behind them. But the Oslo spirit would not, take hold. Just a little after Oslo was signed, a Jewish settler and a follower of a radical Zionist from the United States called Meir Kahane killed 29 Muslim worshippers at a mosque in Hebron. Yitzhak Rabin called him crazy. One Palestinian official said, when they kill us, they are crazy, but when we kill them, we are terrorists. And this really unleashes the current decade-long wave in the suicide bombings and terrorist acts by Hamas, by Islamic Jihad, by Hezbollah. It's kind of ironic, in fact, Hamas, which is one of the better-known groups, which actually does a lot of charity work and things like that, but also conducts terrorist activities. Hamas was actually funded in the 1970s by Israel. Israel was playing a double game. Tel Aviv, the government in Tel Aviv, gave a lot of money and support to Hamas to counterbalance the PLO. Basically, the PLO, they wanted other Muslim groups out there to challenge the PLO. So it's kind of funny, the kind of blowback there. In the fall of 1995, amid these terrorist actions, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a fundamentalist Jew, somebody who was opposed to Rabin's overtures. Rabin had actually begun some minor withdrawals from the West Bank. Rabin was assassinated. Shimon Peres took over, vowed to continue the peace process, but at the same time wanted to show that he was tough. In April of '96 begins Operation Grapes of Wrath, which was an invasion of Lebanon, another invasion of Lebanon to go after Hezbollah, and actually hit a UN compound and killed 100 people, 100 UN officials there. Despite being tough, Peres lost to Benjamin Netanyahu. And Netanyahu basically undid what had been done up to that point. He called Arafat a terrorist. He had run on a campaign of stopping terrorism. He said Israel would never accept a Palestinian state. Jerusalem would remain the undivided capital. Israel claims Jerusalem's the capital of Israel. The rest of the world is Tel Aviv, right? So if you ever see maps, there's a difference there. Netanyahu says the Golan Heights will not be returned to Syria, that Israel has a right to enter Palestinian territories whenever it feels necessary. Netanyahu ends a freeze on Israeli settlements, offers financial incentives to settlers, and begins new settlements in Jerusalem. There's also an influx at this time of Soviet Jews after the Soviet Union falls apart. So by the mid-90s then, the situation in Palestine is as bleak as ever. Israel is intransigent. Arafat had blundered badly with his support of Saddam. And the United States, although offering some even-handed rhetoric, continues to give Israel carte blanche. And the continued attacks on civilians by Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad really, give Israeli hardliners evidence, kind of a self-fulfilling evidence of the perfidy of the Palestinians. The root issue continues to be what it was in 1948. Whose land is this? Who does this belong to? Gaza and the West Bank remain under Israeli control. In addition to that, the settlements continued and increased. And as I said before, these are brutal, violent settlements where bulldozers come in and simply wipe out people's homes. Actually, an American peace worker, a lot of international people went there to try to kind of get in between the homes and the bulldozers. One American, Rachel Corrie, was actually killed when a bulldozer ran her over. So it's a real hairy situation there. Meantime, Iraq remains a vital issue for two reasons: sanctions and the continued search for weapons. The sanctions issue is one that, again, has been really well covered for many years now. After the Gulf War, sanctions were imposed on Iraq, including a food for oil program. Saddam had to meet certain criteria. He could sell oil and get food. and he didn't really accept that until, I think, the mid-90s. At the same time, the United States imposes sanctions on Iraq, so they are not allowed to import certain items. So obviously items that have a military application, although the U.S. broadens the sanctions list. So they can't get medical equipment, food. There are clearly problems, and Saddam is able to exploit these. He treats people desolately anyway, so he's able to exploit these. As a result, the sanctions in Iraq are really devastating. A lot of people die as a result of them. People can't get medical treatment, the incubators, treatment for cancer, children's leukemia. During the war, the water supply was wiped out, so there are great public health problems. The numbers are all over the place. Don't get hung up on them. I think the best evidence based on epidemiological work that appeared in a British journal, The Lancet, is that perhaps 350,000 kids died in excess of what would be expected. For instance, the child mortality rate in Iraq is like double that of Lebanon in the 90s. So clearly the sanctions had a huge human toll. And Saddam was actually able to use this politically to his advantage. I mean, he was, the guy's skimming money, he's building palaces. Those stories were probably true. I mean, the U.S. goes around talking about how evil he is, then he's going to act that way. But the sanctions actually probably helped him to remain in power, to actually extend his control by, kind of saying, look, I'm standing up to the Americans, that kind of thing. At the same time, per the Resolution 687, the United States continued to disarm Iraq. It had UN inspectors there, a whole bunch of them, the best known Scott Ritter and Hans Blix, both of whom have said, you know what, Iraq was essentially disarmed. There had been a deserter who was, I think Saddam's, was it son-in-law or brother-in-law in the mid-90s, who said, we don't have anything left. This was in 1995. Blix has also said the same thing, that Iraq basically was disarmed by the mid-1990s. There was the defector's name was Hussein Kamel, and he said Iraq had destroyed its weapons and the agents used to produce them by the 90s. And it seems now that in fact was the case. But as we know, during the ramp up to the Gulf War, the argument was in fact that the United States needed to disarm Iraq, and again, almost identical to what Saddam had done in 1990. If in fact he had weapons of mass destruction, if in fact he was a threat to the United States, then two things. One would presume that he would actually, instead of hiding it, promote that. I mean, if you want to deter somebody, you don't say, I don't have any weapons. You say, yeah, this is what I have. In the case of North Korea is instructive there. Kim Jong-il said, yes, I have nuclear weapons. And in fact, now Kim Jong-il has negotiating leverage and people are afraid of him, right? So, I mean, this was Nixon's madman theory, right? A madman with a nuclear bomb, that's scary stuff. Saddam, in fact, is denying it. So on one hand, that should give people some evidence. In fact, if he does have weapons of mass destruction, you don't hide them. Secondly, if you have weapons of mass destruction, you probably use them. All right, and in fact, in the ramp up to the war, he didn't. Third, and probably most important, if the U.S. really believed that he had weapons of mass destruction, they would not have given him this window. We need you to disarm by this date. We need you to disarm by this date. It would be irresponsible to do that. If an enemy has weapons of mass destruction and you're afraid he is going to use them against you, then you take them out immediately. You don't say, we're going to give you 3 months, we're going to give you 48 hours, we're going to give you, that's absurd. So I mean, clearly, I think that should have been eminently clear before the war, but and the media is doing all these mea culpas now. So in Iraq, the sanctions and the search for weapons culminate in another war. The war, in a sense, though, was a response to 9/11, which we clearly know from the 9/11 Commission and from everything else that occurred in that time was not Iraq's responsibility. Al-Qaeda. Creation of the Taliban, a creation of the Mujahideen, which was receiving support from the United States, was responsible for the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, was responsible for the attack at Khobar Towers, the American housing complex in Saudi, was responsible for the attack on the Cole, I can't remember that, I think 2000. All right, The embassies, yeah, in Riyadh and Africa, Kenya, and and Tanzania, right? These are all almost certainly Al-Qaeda operations. There is no link between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. There wasn't, there still isn't. And in fact, I mean, Osama bin Laden hated Saddam Hussein because he was secular, he was a Sunni. I mean, it's just the math does, the math doesn't add up. Nonetheless, when those planes hit on September 11th, clearly Paul O'Neill and Richard Clarke and others have said, Bush immediately began to say, what can we do to get back at Iraq? And hence you have this obsession, I mean, a brief war into Afghanistan and then ratcheting up for a war against Iraq, which, I don't have to tell you today, is certainly not going the way a lot of these people assumed it would. In the meantime, the United States continues to support Israel. This is just, if it shows up, there's some numbers there which are really low because these are only up to 1997, but you can see, $74 billion in foreign aid, cost the U.S. taxpayers, including interest, $134 billion. The numbers are much higher than that today. The U.S. Sends the equivalent of $14 million a day to Israel. There's clearly a blowback. On September 11th, George Bush and others plaintively wailed, why do they hate us? And in fact, nothing justifies that. To suggest that the U.S. has done evil things and therefore this is acceptable is ridiculous. This wasn't the Sandinistas. This wasn't Ho Chi Minh. This wasn't Fidel Castro flying an airplane into the World Trade Center. This wasn't somebody who had a grievance with the United States. This was somebody who actually received a lot of support from the United States. Why did he do it? I don't know. Why did he say he did it? He said he did it because of continued American presence in Saudi, American bases at the birthplace of Islam, continued sanctions on Iraq, which were killing tremendous numbers of children, and continued support of Israel, which was repressing the Palestinians. Personally, I don't think Osama bin Laden really gives a damn about the Palestinians or any of that. But what's really critical is the fact that the so-called Arab Street, millions upon millions upon millions of Arabs believe that. And they, said, the United States, those are all true. The U.S. does have bases in Saudi Arabia. It has repressed Palestinians. It has continued this occupation of Iraq. And therefore, the level of animosity created is quite great. It harkens back to that May 1st, 1950 memoranda and the 1954 National Security Council report, all of which said America's support of Israel has created great animosity and hostility in this region, and they are the tide is running inimical to our interests. So to somehow say, they hate us because we're so good, they hate us for our freedom, whether you believe that, whether it's true, doesn't matter. In a sense, what's critical is how the world in that region perceives the United States. And so September 11th to them wasn't just September 11th. It was Mossadegh, and it was Nasser, and it was Suez, and it was the Six-Day War, and the Ramadan War, and the continued settlements in Gaza and the West Bank. You can't look at it, just as this particular act of crazed, use, fill in the blank, Muslim, Arab, whatever kind of stereotype you want to use. You can't, you can look at it that way, and maybe it is that way. But the fact of the matter is there's a real history there that goes back to the turn of the century, and it stems from some fundamental issues that still haven't been resolved, right? Millions of Palestinians don't have a homeland. They live in refugee camps. Their homes are bulldozed. Israelis come in and take their land away from them. That hasn't been resolved. And until it does, you have issues. Wealthy Arab states like Saudi Arabia, especially, are so closely connected to the United States that their own people respond against them. In both Saudi Arabia and in Egypt, you have Islamic fundamentalist groups opposed to the governments. They're Hosni Mubarak and the House of Saud. Okay? Because of their connections to the United States, they are seen as essentially U.S. clients or U.S. puppets. That has to be resolved. You have the United States projecting its power in Iraq in ways not only that create great devastation in that country, but unleash waves of anti-Americanism, which in the long term are inimical to American interests, as Atchison suggested, over a half century ago. It's alienated America's allies. It's made us all less safe, Code Orange notwithstanding. People are, act differently. It's clearly led to whole-scale attacks on, fundamental liberty, Homeland Security, the Patriot Act. These are all, modern-day versions of the Palmer raids and McCarthyism and COINTELPRO. So why do they hate us? I'm not sure that's even a useful question. It should be what is the history there? How did we get here? How did we get to this point? And it would take many hours of many detailed discussions and arguments to actually, thresh this out even more than we have today. But I hope this has been a good start. Any questions? Okay.